Hey everybody, we are going to keep looking at ecology and we're going to start chapter 53, which is on community ecology. So this is going to be the study of interactions between different species that live in the same area. And we're going to be looking at interspecific interactions first. And so these are the interactions between different species. These could be positive, negative, or neutral. And some examples are going to be coevolution, predation, mimicry, competition, and then we'll look at a couple different types of symbioses. So coevolution is when two species have reciprocal evolution to each other. So really common examples are going to be flowers and their pollinators. So flowers tend to evolve and pollinators tend to evolve so that they fit together really well. So this example here is a flower and its hummingbird that is getting the nectar and will also end up pollinating it. Predation is another example, and here you're looking at a pretty famous predator-prey relationship. So you've got the lynx and the hare. So the lynx would be the predator and then the hare would be the prey. It's what's getting eaten. So this is obviously a really positive relationship for the predator because he's getting fed. Not so great for the prey who's getting eaten. A slight deviation on this is the idea of herbivory, and so this is when an organism eats plants or parts of a plant or algae. And so the herbivore may have special adaptations to find their prey, and the plants may have adaptations to avoid being eaten. But here you still have the herbivore eating the plant, and so again, good for the herbivore, not so hot for the plant. So both predation and herbivory often result in interesting defenses or adaptations. You can have different types of coloring to help with camouflage. So I'm going to leave these two pictures up here for a second. I know I'm blocking part of one right here, but I want to see if you guys can tell what you're looking at. So this is cryptic coloration. This is a passive defense where prey is essentially just camouflaged against its environment, so it's much harder for its predator to find. Here we have the aposematic coloring. This is going to be the use of very conspicuous colors in toxic or unpalatable organisms to warn off predators. So here we have a poison arrow frog. So again, instead of being camouflaged, here you're looking at a frog that's just super bright blue, stands out against its background really well, and so this is used essentially as a warning, like, hey, I taste bad, or I'm poisonous, so don't eat me. Next, we're going to look at mimicry, and this is a defense mechanism where the mimic, whatever it is, has a resemblance to another species. And there's going to be two models that we're looking at. First, we have Bastian mimicry, and this is when a palatable species mimics an unpalatable model. And so the example here is you have some hawk moth larva, and when you look at it, it almost looks like the head of a snake sort of sticking off that branch. And so that is mimicry. It's trying to make itself look like that snake. Then with Mullerian mimicry, this is when you have two unpalatable species that resemble each other. And so in this case, you've got a bee and a yellow jacket. They both have the black and white stripe, or I'm sorry, the black and yellow stripes. And so it's sort of reinforces this idea that if you're going to try to go after something that has black and yellow stripes, it's probably not going to go over very well. Competition is when you have two species that rely on the same limiting resource, and there are two different kinds. You have intraspecific competition, which is usually more severe than interspecific competition. And so if you think about what is intra versus interspecific, why do you think that competition is usually more severe? So we'll kind of come back to that idea in class. The competitive exclusion principle predicts that two species with the same requirement cannot coexist in the same community, that one species will survive and the other will go extinct or will leave that community. An ecological niche is essentially how we describe how a species fits into an ecosystem. So species can have niches species cannot have niches that overlap, again, because of that competitive exclusion principle. And so you can't have two different species in the same area fitting into the same niche because they're going to be competing for all of their resources, and so you would see one survive and one not. There's two types of niches that we can talk about. There's the fundamental niche type, which is what a species is theoretically capable of using, and then there's also the realized niche, and this is what a species can actually use. So fundamentally, you can say that species might be capable of using all kinds of different areas within their niche or all kinds of different resources, but in reality, they may only be using part of that. So we have lots of examples where here we can look at the fundamental niche versus the realized niche. And essentially what's happening here is we are breaking up this area so that multiple species can use the same general area without overlapping with each other. And we call this resource partitioning. And this is a way that species avoid niche overlap by splitting up the available resources. Now the example I really want to talk about is with the anole lizards, because we saw a video on this, we did a big activity. And so you guys know that we have lots of different types of anole lizards, and they look very different based on where they live, and they are actually able to have lots of different anole species in the same area because they use different parts of the forest. So you're going to have some that are way up high in the canopy, then you're going to have some that are a little bit lower, some that are on branches, some that are on trunks, some that are down in bushes, and some that are on the ground. And so if we're looking at this area, it's like it's one forest, but you've got all of these different levels within the forest for the anole lizards to use, and so they will break up the resources through resource partitioning so that lots of these species can survive because they're going to be successful in different areas. So next we've got symbiosis. This is when two different species live together in direct contact. Some forms of symbiosis are good, some are bad, and some it depends who you are. So with parasitism, the parasite harms the host. Parasites may be external or internal. And actually really well adapted parasites don't kill the host, because if you're a parasite and you kill your host, you now have the task of venturing out to find a new host. So the best parasites will be the ones that can survive on the same host without killing it. Now parasitism is going to be really beneficial for the parasite and not so good for the host. Commensalism, then, this is when one partner benefits, but the other one doesn't really get affected a lot. So here you have the cattle and the egret. So again, this is going to be positive for one individual and neutral for the other. With mutualism now, this is, you can see the plus plus, so this is going to be beneficial for both partners. So you have this example of the acacia tree and ants, but also pollinators and flowers. That shows a mutualistic relationship as well. And here you can also see that you have an area that's been cleared by ants at the base of an acacia tree. Again, mutualism. Now let's take a look at species with very specific impacts within their ecosystems. So some species have larger impacts or almost carry more importance within their ecosystem than, or within their community, than other species. And there's three different types. There's the dominant species, keystone species, and foundation species. So the dominant species would be the species that is the most abundant or has the highest biomass in the community. Biomass, bio mean life, mass the amount of matter, so it's going to be the individuals that essentially take up the most matter, most living matter within that community. And these are going to have a major effect on the community both biotically and abiotically. So why do you think that these individuals could be dominant? They could be the best competitor. Are they the best at avoiding predators and disease? And actually what's interesting is that sometimes you see that it's actually invasive species that fit that last explanation. If you have an invasive species brought into a new area, they may actually not have any predators in the area, so they could do really well because nobody eats them. So an example would be chestnuts. They used to make up about 40% of the forest. They were lost though between 1910 and 1950 because of a fungal disease. This had major impact on several different industries, but there was also a biotic response to that within the communities. So some tree species increased in abundance to fill in that gap, and so mammals and birds were still okay. Trees came in to kind of fill that gap, but you did see 7 species of insects go extinct because of that change. Next, we have keystone species. These are not necessarily a dominant species, but they do have a major impact on community structure. And so a lot of times these are actually top predators. These top predators are really important because they will control the population sizes of the species that they eat. And so an example would be sea otters. Um, and what happens, when sea otters are not there is you see essentially like the overgrowth of other things within the food chain. If you have too many sea otters, then they can actually really start to sort of diminish the population numbers of other individuals. Then you've got foundation species, and these are species that cause physical changes in the environment that affect others. A lot of times these would be your large grazers, so things like bison. Also, beavers are a really good example because beavers will make dams, and so they are changing causing very obvious physical changes in the environment. All right, so your lecture question for today, explain the difference between a foundation species and a keystone species. How are they similar? How are they different? I'd like you guys to send me a message via the class website with your answer to that question. Thanks, guys.